snip. I want them to do that. I want them to do
Hello and welcome to The Insight. I'm Daniel Harrington, Chief Operating Officer at Intelligence Fusion. Today I'm joined by Senior Regional Analyst Matt Pratton and also Vincent Fevrier, as well as our CEO and founder, Michael McCabe. In this episode, we are taking a look at what the US election will look like from a security perspective and the ramifications of that in the USA. If you like our content, please like, share and subscribe. So why has the US presidential election become so emotive in 2020? From my perspective, and I think from many supporters, this election seems to have transcended personalities and become a battle for the nation's ideological future. On one side, you've got Trump and the Republicans who are representing the forces of conservatism, nationalism, and law and order. And on the other side, according to many people from both sides, you've got the Democrats potentially representing globalism, socialism, and even communism to some hardcore Trump supporters, as well as the deep state. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think why this year is just so significant compared to maybe previous elections is just kind of a combination of what's happened in the last 4 years, in addition to what's happened in recent months with the likes of COVID-19 pandemic, which has taken a huge toll on not only individuals, but businesses across the country, the economy as a wider impact. But also with police violence, which has led to anti-police and anti-racism protests across the country, particularly in urban areas of Portland, Seattle, New York. And then it's just, I think people see it as not only an election for the president, but rather for the soul of the nation and control of the institutions that are quite significant. And I think we've seen this recently. Within the last week or so, with the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because now there's an opening, and so it's created this situation to where do the Republicans nominate and vote in a Supreme Court Justice before the election, or do we wait till after the election, where either Trump or Biden gets the opportunity to do so, which was again a conflict previous to the 2016 election with President Obama and Mitch McConnell in the Senate. And I think that institution is important for individuals because it's a lifetime appointment. And so there's quite significant power for either party to control that, to get kind of the policies put in place and that they'd like. So I think it's not just voting for the individual right now, but voting for what they believe in, their points of views and control of the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's just so much polarization politically, and it's not just in the US, it is globally that we're seeing this, where both sides have their narratives and their issues that they're focusing on, and there's a lack of center ground, and there's a lack of people actually listening to each other and actually trying to find that center ground, which I find really worrying. And if we just kind of take some of those groups who are involved, so if we take Antifa as an example, if you read the opening of the Anti-Fascist Handbook, in it, the author talks about the burning down of the Victoria Islamic Center in Victoria, Texas, hours after the announcement of Trump's administration's Muslim ban, weeks after a flurry of hundreds of proposed anti-LGBTQ laws in 2017, a man smashed through the front door of Casa Ruby in Washington, D.C., a trans advocacy center, and assaulted a trans woman. A day after Donald Trump's election, Latino students in Royal Oak Middle School in Michigan were brought to tears by their classmates chanting "Build the Wall," as well as incidents of white supremacist army veterans killing a black man called Timothy Kaufman in New York, as well as a spate of Jewish cemetery desecrations. And so if you kind of come at it from the position of the Antifa and anti-fascists, they believe that Trump is a fascist president and is bringing in a fascist regime. On the other side of it, you kind of look at it from a Republican perspective, and you just look at the things like Russia collusion, Spygate, as an example. People forget that when John McCain was running for president in 2008, he was also accused of Russian collusion, which was mainly linked to Wall Street Journal articles by Glenn Simpson, and that's the same Glenn Simpson who ended up going on to found Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS, who were hired by the Washington Free Beacon in September 2015, which is a conservative political website, to do opposition research on Trump and other Republican presidential candidates. And in the spring, once they actually knew it was Trump who was going to be the presidential nomination, Fusion GPS were then actually taken over and hired by Perkins Coie on behalf of Hillary Clinton's campaign. Now, all the way through this, you ended up having the Steele dossier, which was then used by the FBI to actually do wiretapping and spying on the Trump campaign. So if you look at that from a Republican perspective, they feel as if there is this deep state, this group of people in positions of power who have been against Trump from the beginning. So just two examples there just show you where these two sides are kind of coming at this, and why it is so politicized and why it is so worrying as to how this is going to play out.
And I guess, during the last 4 years, there's been very little attempt by either side for any kind of rapprochement or coming together on a center ground. So really, in essence, what you're saying there is that this was already going to be a contentious election, and then exacerbating that, really, we've got COVID-19, recent social unrest, and also the issue of law and order as well within many cities as a consequence of the social unrest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it's just 4 years of kind of adversarial opposition from the Democrats towards the Republicans. And like you said, there's just been no middle ground. And so ultimately, this election is quite significant for either party. But we have to remember that in presidential elections are one thing, but you're not only voting for the president during these times, you're also voting a certain amount of senators and representatives. So I think we have to remember that the president is only as strong as kind of Congress allows him to be. And so right now Republicans control the Senate, but Democrats control the House. So it'll be interesting to see as well what happens, not only from in the presidential level, but also in Congress. Do the Democrats retain the House and maybe gain the Senate as well? Or do the Republicans retake control of the House as well as gain a president to where Trump feels emboldened to pass more policies that are maybe controversial? So
looking at scenarios, what happens if Trump does win the election?
Yeah, that's certainly the one major question for what's coming up. I think, with regards to Trump being re-elected, we'll consider what happened in 2016. There's certainly a historical precedent for it. So, in the aftermath of 2016, when Trump became president-elect, there was widespread protests from Hillary Clinton supporters. A lot of protest marches. The most common one, excuse me. Among the most common one was a chant of "Not my president, not my president," and it's aside from widespread protests in the streets from Hillary Clinton supporters, of course, be smaller instances of say university students going to libraries and doing the same thing. Essentially, there was, among the sort of I suppose hardcore Democrat supporters and particularly those who wanted Hillary Clinton in, there was just a widespread denial of Trump being elected. They
so
just
you see that
the results
happening again. An initial phase of protests against Trump from.
I mean, we saw it with George W. Bush on his second inauguration. There was mass protests against him, and then even at the Trump inauguration, you had protesters trying to block roads. 6 police officers were injured. You had black bloc groups and self-described anarchists who engaged in sporadic acts of vandalism, rioting, and violence. And if Trump gets into for a second term, I can just see that exacerbating and just seeing even more unrest at his inauguration.
Yeah.
Do you also see Trump being emboldened, being elected a second time, surviving a series of scandals or investigations? Do you see Trump being emboldened by a second term and potentially willing to confront what he perceives as
Yes, short version, a short answer for that. But I think the reason for that would essentially be he's, throughout the unrest we've seen from BLM and Antifa in Portland and Seattle especially, he's very often been on Twitter tweeting law and order. And I suppose if President Trump were to be re-elected, he would likely see that as a mandate to begin actually taking concrete steps towards addressing the social unrest. And in fact, there could even be a scenario where Trump is able to realistically try invoking the Insurrection Act. That's actually been a sort of a talking point in recent unrest with regards to why isn't he invoking the Insurrection Act. I suppose if he were to be re-elected, that would essentially, he could regard that as a mandate to do so, or take a variety of other steps, to address what's been going on, especially with Portland and Seattle.
I mean, he's already recently named Portland, Seattle, and New York as anarchist jurisdictions to remove federal funding from those areas. So it feels like it's just going to become more combative between the Republicans and the Democrats. And even just recently, he tweeted on September the 22nd, a few weeks ago, I banned efforts to indoctrinate government employees with divisive and harmful sex and race-based ideologies. Today, I've expanded that ban to people and companies that do business with our country. The United States military, government, contractors, and grantees, Americans should be taught to take pride in our great country. And if you don't, there's nothing in it for you. So I can just see more and more of these policies trying to roll back the efforts of progressives in the US, which I think is just going to lead to a more combative stance between the two different parties.
Well, absolutely. I think, like, we're talking about him being emboldened and things like that. We've seen it just from his rhetoric and his tweets that he's put out, not only regarding his policies or other policies, but the other party's policies, but just in terms of even the vote coming up, when this month he tweeted to his supporters to vote by mail, and then if their vote hadn't been tabulated that they could see online, then to go to the polling stations and vote, which initially would be illegal because you're not allowed to vote twice. So he's already emboldened in telling his supporters to do things that aren't legal. So I think getting a second term would allow him to kind of push further his policies that he sees fit. And we've seen it during COVID. He kind of undid regulations, environmental regulations. So that in itself will get environmental groups to protest those. So I think when we talk about what happens if Trump is reelected, it's, like we've said, I think a lot of similar unrest that we've been seeing in previous months and more protests like we've seen in the last 4 years, just because he'll feel that he has the mandate from the people to pass certain policies which are contradictory to what democratic individuals believe. So unrest is probably the bottom line of what we'll see.
Just a question, do we think that either candidate will actually unite the country? No. Clearly we don't think Trump will, but will Biden?
I think there'll be an attempt to draw in moderates from both sides with Biden. He's already stated, I think, before that his intention is to try and unite America again. I think we'll see an attempt to enact more business friendly, to continue with maybe some of Trump's more pro-business or friendly policies. But I think it'll be very difficult because, as you said there, we've got an increasingly polarized population now. So it will be a tough uphill battle for Joe Biden.
And I think it'll be tough because the protests we're seeing aren't necessarily against one or the other. Sometimes we see anti-government groups who are more opposed to kind of government infringement on their rights. And so if Biden, say, is elected, it might be hard to unite because initially he'll have to tackle some issues which might require government to step in, which will get opposition from these anti-government groups that we've seen pop up, especially during the times of COVID. So I think he'll try to unite the country and try to restore faith in an institution and in the government, which I think a lot of people have lost within the last 4 years. But I think it'll be an uphill battle. And I think he'll have to pick and choose and be tactical in what he does. and which policies he reverses. Because when Trump was elected, he was pretty quick at reversing and using executive orders and getting rid of regulations that the Obama administration had put in place. But I think if Biden gets elected, I think he'll have to be more tactical in what he does, because if he wants to get the more moderate Republicans on his side, and if he wants to kind of create this middle ground for both parties, I don't think he'll be able to just come in and, with the swoop of a pen, just get rid of everything that Trump has done, because ultimately Trump has gotten support for what he's done on certain issues, whether it be foreign policy or domestic policy. So I think to unite the country, you can't cater to just one side or the other. You have to be more tactical in how you do it.
He seems to be, Joe Biden, this is moving himself away from this stance of defunding the police. The worry is when that actually happens. So he gets into power, and you look at Antifa and you look at BLM, and they say, we don't support either Democrats or Republicans. Democrats are just the better option of the two. So I certainly don't see an end to Antifa and the BLM movement if President Biden becomes President Biden. I can only see perhaps a short pause to kind of see how he then reacts in his presidency. And then we may just see an increase in protests and rioting again, because they're not seeing the policies that they want put in place.
And how do you see the kind of the hardcore elements of Trump supporters, his base there? How do you see them reacting if Joe Biden is elected president?
Well, there certainly will be a reaction, although I don't think it would be along the lines of what we saw in 2016 with with Democrat supporters just simply out protesting, not being able to accept the result of the election. I think from, say, sort of more hard, rather than sort of Republicans, more so from the actual the far right, the right wing extremists. I think you'll see the possibility of a sort of a repeat of Charlottesville back in August 2017, and what caused that was actually not actually just the simple election of a government official, but a government policy to take down with Confederate statues. So I think, say, from if a Biden presidency were to come in from, I suppose, the extreme opponents, say from the far right wing extremism, it will be a case of if depends on what a Biden administration, what kind of policies they would try to enact. So I think a real good example would be any kind of gun, national gun legislation. That would be I suppose a trigger for a reaction from Republicans, but also there would be the possibility of the source of unrest that was seen in Charlottesville back in 2017.
And I think that's definitely possible in regards to, if you look at the number of hate groups or anti-government groups that are in the that are registered in the U.S. By certain think tanks, that tend to increase when the Democrat becomes president, and kind of decrease when a Republican is president. However, I think so. You might see kind of opposition towards those policies, and you talk about gun control from Biden if he comes into office. But I think the initial step will, if he does come into office, will be to tackle COVID-19, the pandemic, and kind of help the economy and small businesses. And I think looking at his campaign, and he's kind of taken a step back from this as well, but talks about kind of mask mandates, not so much from federal government, but working with local officials and state governors to kind of pass mask mandates. And I think when we saw the types of protests that were happening when the Trump administration was putting restrictions in place during COVID, where we had armed protesters at state capitals across the country demanding the country reopen, if the Biden administration were to pass such a mandate or work to pass such a mandate, I think we're likely to see these types of anti-government groups like the Boogaloo Boys or kind of other types of state militias protesting and crying out for because of government infringement.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. That it's going to be far less palatable for right-wing groups to get this sort of legislation from Biden rather than Trump. And I do think you will get libertarian groups like the Boogaloo Boys, but you'll also get the militia type groups, and you'll also get the lunatic fringe who'll just piggyback on these movements and try to escalate the situation. I mean, for me, it's fairly clear how the left will react. I think we've seen it through the last few years of President Trump and his presidency. You know, we've seen protests, we've seen rioting, we've seen sustained rioting, we've seen the attempts to create autonomous zones, and I could see those increasing if Trump gets into another presidency, another second term. But I also think you could sort of see a flare up at certain clash points between different groups. So say, for example, on the day of President Trump's inauguration, there's some sort of protest outside the White House by left-wing groups and a counter-protest by right-wing groups. The worry is that that then escalates to some sort of confrontation and perhaps with the use of weapons. On the right, to kind of assess how they would react to a Biden presidency, I think it's worth just kind of fleshing out what the right really looks like. You know, if we kind of talk about the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, that was predominantly made up of ethnic nationalist groups. So you had people like Richard Spencer was there, the National Policy Institute. You had a variety of different groups like the Traditional Workers' Party, who'd all come together and then were counter-protested by left-wing groups. But within the US, you have the civic nationalists and you have the ethno-nationalists, and so the alt-right and the alt-right as they're seen. So the civic nationalists can be made up of any ethnicity. It's purely about nationalism and seeing yourself as being an American, whereas for the ethno-nationalist, it's very much about looking at the world through the prism of race, which, you know, the worry looking at the left now is that they're also starting to force this agenda of trying to make everybody look through the prism of race. But on the right, you know, I think what you said before, I think that is really accurate. I think it will be push button issues, things like legislation regarding the wearing of masks. I think those will be flashpoints, but also perhaps stuff around the Second Amendment side of it.
So, in summary, really, from a kind of Republican or a hardcore right-wing view, it's going to be mainly symbology or legislation that initiates social unrest, whereas the left wing, I think they're already established. They've already had 4 years of anti-government demonstrations, and as Michael said, we've kind of seen historically what kind of direct actions that they're capable of, and the kind of protests that they do use. I think the challenge will be, there is an unknown quantity about, say, the certain elements or fringes of the far right, such as the alt-right, where if you've got neo-Nazis or white supremacist groups, there's the potential there for lone wolf attacks or for, you know, a non-organized threat actor to carry out any kind of high-profile incident. Whereas I think looking at the far left, you've got more organized groups which carry out specific acts of protest or looting. Whereas I think, yeah, from a far right perspective, there's more of an unknown quantity which may morph into political assassination attempts or specific violence.
It's a good point, and from the extremist perspective, what we always see is that they are driven by conspiracy theories, and the big ones that, quite frankly, are getting traction at the moment is things like QAnon. QAnon being a conspiracy theory that alleges that there is a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global sex trafficking ring that's plotting against President Trump, who is then battling against them, leading to a day of reckoning involving the mass arrest of journalists and politicians. So I can see some sort of somebody on the lunatic fringe reacting to one of these conspiracy theories if President Trump doesn't get into a second term, and potentially we see terrorism attacks as a result of that.
And I think we've seen instance with preceding QAnon with Pizzagate, where an individual went to a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. And was armed looking for a sex trafficking ring. And in regards to QAnon, we've seen similar things in Tucson, in a Tucson cement plant in 2018, where the individual alleged that it was a child sex trafficking camp. But what we also see is that conspiracy theory is becoming mainstream, not only in followers of the far right or Trump followers, but also we've seen kind of Q signs at certain Trump rallies, but also within individual people running for Congress, for seats of power. So I think it is frightening, and I think it shows kind of, like you said, the potential for lone actors acting out in terms of whether terrorist attack or any other attacks. And I think it shows kind of the differences between the threat from the left and the threat from the right in terms of from what I see, is the threat from the left being kind of more organized groups like Antifa, like BLM, and protesting, rioting, looting. Although there's been studies that show that on the internet, on social media, we've seen far left groups advocating for more violence, which is something new, using things like meme or kind of popular culture references like we have before on 8chan and things like that with far-right groups. But I think on the right, then the threat becomes by those lone individual actors who are easier for them to kind of fly under the radar to commit their acts. So I think it's kind of two distinct threats from either side, which, based on the outcome of the election, is quite frightening.
And it's a sign of the polarization, because you have people now who are in their own camps who support people who perhaps they wouldn't have traditionally supported a decade ago. But it's almost an ugly baby contest. It's like, well, I far rather prefer Trump to Biden, so I'm going to support him. But people also end up in these little bubbles of information where they're just receiving confirmation regarding what they think from people of the same mindset. And I think part of the issue is the whole issue with social media. So you've had right-wing people who've been thrown off Twitter. You now are seeing a rise in right-wing social media channels like Parler. So you now have people on different ends of the political spectrum on different social media channels and never meeting in the middle and having conversations with each other regarding their political beliefs, which again just adds to the effect of polarization.
Yeah, and that's the thing with kind of algorithms from these social media platforms, where you're searching for certain things and then all you're getting is that information. You're never getting the other side, so you're, like you said, stuck within that single bubble, and that can become dangerous.
So in terms of foreign influence or interference, do you think that countries outside the USA are taking advantage of this divisiveness and polarization of politics to be able to interfere with the election process?
Yes, it's definitely a case. In fact, one thing that's sort of I've been tending to notice is when there's references to sort of foreign interference or sort of in sort of collusion. From what we can tell, actually, it's more of a case of foreign actors actually not so much trying to interfere with the actual electoral process or trying to corrupt any actual official. It's more of a case of trying to just simply make the increase the level of polarization. So not rather sort of interfere with the actual election process, is just actually have people just having irreconcilable differences between each other. And the Russians are certainly very effective at that. In fact, with an incident I was tracking in Ukraine a few days ago, actually the security service there actually uncovered a major bot farm which had been spreading, not so much in this particular case, it hadn't actually been spreading, had any involvement in US politics, but was actually doing what's been doing sort of the similar tactics, but applying it to Ukraine. So foreign interference, it's definitely there, but it's more sort of focused on turning people against each other rather than actually interfering with with the actual being any sort of tallying of votes or corrupting an official over here or the president himself. It's more so just making people on the ground essentially hate each other.
It comes down to as simple as divide and conquer. And it's, as part of the research for this, I read the report of the Select Committee on Intelligence from the United States Senate on Russian active measures campaign and interference in the 2016 election. And it's worth just kind of reading some of the findings from that, because I do think it will be applicable to this election as well. So it stated, in 2016, Russian operatives associated with the St. Petersburg-based Internet Research Agency, or the IRA, used social media to conduct an information warfare campaign designed to spread disinformation and societal division in the United States. Masquerading as Americans, these operatives used targeted advertisements, intentionally falsified news articles, self-generated content, and social media platform tools to interact with and attempt to deceive tens of millions of social media users in the United States. The campaign sought to polarize Americans on the basis of societal, ideological, and racial differences, provoked real-world events, and was part of a foreign government's covert support of Russia's favored candidate in the US presidential election. And again, part of the findings stated, where the intelligence community assessed that the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances, where possible, by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorably to him. And the committee found that the IRA social media activity was overtly and almost invariably supportive of then President Trump, and to the detriment of Secretary Clinton's campaign. The committee found that Russia's targeting of the 2016 US presidential election was part of a broader, sophisticated and ongoing information warfare campaign designed to sow discord in American politics and society. And IRA operators sought to impact primaries for both major parties and may have helped to sink the hopes of candidates more hostile to Russian interest long before the field narrowed. And the committee found that no single group of Americans was targeted by IRA information operatives more than African Americans. By far, race and related issues were the preferred target of the information warfare campaign designed to divide the country in 2016. And what have we seen as a result of that? You've kind of seen, the huge growth of the BLM movement, which is getting to a point where we're seeing cities like Portland and Seattle and New York witnessing significant civil unrest as well as rioting. And if I was Russia and I was looking at the US, and if I wanted them to be less outward focusing and looking at Russian operations around the world, and I want them just to be concentrated on the US, I'd be pushing for another Trump election, because it feels like that is only going to exacerbate the problem even further and create even more division within US society.
On the other hand, though, as well, you've got other countries out there that may be looking potentially supporting a Democrat candidate such as Joe Biden. If you look at Iran or China, Trump's belligerent attitude to on the international relations front to them over the last few years may in turn make them themselves enact their own information warfare policies and try and influence an anti-Trump outcome on social media as well. So I think we've got a multitude of foreign countries with potential to interfere in this election. So moving on, in a worst case scenario, what if neither side, the Democrats or the Republicans, admit defeat in this election?
Well, I think that's a question that's a lot of congressmen and congresswomen in the United States are asking themselves, and even individuals, just based on kind of the rhetoric that we've seen from Trump in regards to we might not know the results for a while or forever, or he's not sure exactly what he'll do. Depending on the results the night of the election. So I think, and it's led to some Congress members asking generals, to who do you take your oath? Is it a constitution of a president? Like what will happen during if Trump refuses to leave office, if he does lose the election? And a contested election is something that we saw in 2000 with Al Gore and President George Bush in regards to the results in Florida. But at that time, it was very much taken to the courts, and Al Gore told his supporters not to protest and let the courts do its job. And in the end, we saw Al Gore concede the election and George W. Bush become president. This time around, if a contested election happened, I think, yes, the courts will play a factor, because ultimately, law and order, courts have to make the decision. But I think in regards to protest on the streets, it's something that will likely happen from either side, depending on who loses. We'll either see Trump supporters in the streets with counter-protest, or we'll see Biden protesters in the streets with counter-protest as well. So I think it'll be an interesting outcome if that happens, and a number of think tanks have been trying to run scenarios on what can either campaign possibly do, whether it's replacing electors in certain states to then vote in favor of them, or so it's one of those situations that one hopes not to happen.
Do you think on the medium term or the longer term, it could undermine the faith in the democratic institutions within the USA?
I mean, just on that, so Bloomberg paid for a study by a Democrat data and analytics firm, and what they found and assessed was that President Trump will likely appear to have won by a landslide on election night, even if he ultimately loses when all the votes are counted. So what they're saying is that the Democrats are less likely to actually vote in person, so he'll actually appear to win by a landslide on the evening. But then once the votes are counted, perhaps over the next 2 weeks, they think it'll actually swing towards Biden at that point. The worry being, and I kind of think back to my own career and working in Ramadi in 2010, 2006 election in Iraq, you had the Sunnis who just did not participate in the electoral process at all. They finally kind of engaged with it in 2010. They supported Ayad Alawi. Ayad Alawi won the popular vote, but he couldn't actually form a coalition, so it ended up being another Maliki presidency, and the Sunnis felt massively disenfranchised by the electoral process. And that's the real worry for me, is that there is such a lack of faith in institutions across the West. What then happens when the electorate lose faith in the actual democratic process? And it just feeds into this polarization and the potential for some sort of confrontation during the term of the next president.
And I think in the United States, I think we're seeing this kind of loss of faith in the institution in regard to the Electoral College. Because even in 2016, when President Trump won the election because he won the Electoral College, which decides who becomes president, he had lost the popular vote. And even though he won the election, he still complained and said that Hillary only won the popular vote because millions of illegals had voted, although those are unsubstantiated claims. In regards to kind of vote counting, there's groups like Protect the Results and Progressive Change Campaign Committee who are coordinating efforts to kind of ensure public interest after the election to defend the vote counting. And they're doing so based on the assumption that Trump may intimidate state officials tabulating mail-in ballots by mobilizing armed supporters outside these areas where votes are being counted. And I think that's not unrealistic that we see certain groups of either side probably outside the polling stations. And we've seen it just recently, a couple of weeks ago in Fairfax, Virginia, where supporters of President Trump were outside a polling station just having a small rally. But that kind of puts into question things like electioneering, where individuals technically aren't supposed to kind of influence who people vote for at a certain distance from a polling station, or where anything that might be supporting a certain candidate, just so that people who maybe come undecided don't get influenced by individuals. So I think this election might see kind of groups on either side kind of towing the line just to kind of maybe influence. So it's a possibility.
So if neither side accepts the election results and we have a state of impasse, and we start to see, in a worst case scenario, unrest or violence occurring in maybe urban areas, in contentious areas politically, do you think there's a chance that we'll start to see, from maybe a most dangerous course of action, civilians carrying out tit-for-tat attacks of violence against ideological opponents, such as targeting businesses that they don't agree with, or targeting police or law enforcement representatives, or even politicians who are perceived as being sided with a rival group or political ideology?
Yeah, I think with regards to, I suppose, targeting of businesses, that would certainly be a possible likelihood in areas where, say, Portland, Seattle, and New York, where a lot of Antifa and I suppose the sort of very anti-capitalist elements in America have a lot of freedom of movement. So I dare say that in those areas, that's where businesses would be particularly targeted, and likely Minneapolis as well. In terms of, I suppose, with sort of attacks on police, in fact, I think there is one thing that could actually sort of exacerbate social unrest during and after the election, is kind of a sort of a wild card situation of an officer-involved shooting. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, with the death of George Floyd, that kicked off the widespread unrest we're seeing, and a lot of the anti-police rhetoric and efforts to defund the police in a lot of Democrat-run cities. Now, interesting part about not the instance of George Floyd's death. There's certainly elements where the police officer involved needs to be held accountable for his actions. But in officer-involved shootings after George Floyd's death, two in particular, there's been cases where there's been quite a lot of very hard evidence to indicate the officers acted in self-defense, but BLM and left-wing extremists and sort of anti-police sort of advocates have whipped up tensions to cause unrest. Two particular cases of this, probably the most distinct ones, would be an incident involving Rashad Brooks in Atlanta, where he fell asleep behind the wheel of his car. There was indications he was heavily intoxicated. The Wendy's staff at that location actually called police. They responded, questioned Brooks, and as they were placing him under arrest, he began to resist violently, ended up being able to grab one of the police officers' tasers, fire the taser at an officer, and try and fire again whilst he was fleeing. At that point, officers shot him dead. Now, there was at least two camera feeds that showed that the officers were acting in self-defense at the time, and that footage was released quickly. However, BLM and a lot of sort of anti-police advocates in the area whipped up tensions really, to a significant level, despite the evidence in place that
So
there
we
was
see
indications.
agitators taking advantage of the situation. Yeah.
And even so, actually, probably an even more stark example was the incident involving Hakeem Littleton in Detroit, where police were actually executing an arrest warrant on a different person entirely. It was a drugs warrant, and Littleton was a bystander. It was the suspect that the police were arresting was his friend, and as they were arresting him, Littleton pulled out a pistol, and I don't know how on earth he missed. It was at point blank range. Tried to shoot the arresting officer dead. Of course, officers responded, but despite the body camera footage being released on it, there was widespread unrest towards Detroit PD. So, what could whip up unrest a lot in terms of sort of anti-police rhetoric and any kind of situation of a most dangerous course of action, that would certainly be a kind of a trigger that would contribute to that sort of situation occurring.
Just on that, sorry, so you kind of mentioned the most dangerous course of action. So in terms of looking at indicators and warnings historically, I think it's worrying seeing groups like the militia groups that are forming. There was the recent confrontation between the militia group near where the Confederate statue is, and the NFAC, which is a black nationalist group who all come out armed. So these are worrying scenes that we're starting to see, which I think could feed into that most dangerous course of action scenario. Kind of what you were mentioning, Matt, with that Wendy's incident, the restaurant, I believe, was burnt down after that. So from a business perspective, there is going to be intimidation from businesses to actually report on these sorts of crimes out of intimidation, that they feel that they're going to be attacked as a result of it. And I think that's a key thing that we should really talk about, is just what is the business impact going to be from this. And I think we're seeing, as an example, just recently, the retailer Columbia Sportswear have permanently closed down their store in Seattle, and they are one of, I think it's 126 street-level businesses that have left the downtown area since March, as the pandemic forced many merchants to close. But also you've seen significant violence and rioting and protests that have occurred there, which has impacted businesses, especially in the areas of where Chaz and Chop were. And I was kind of watching some video footage of I think it was a garage just next to where Chaz was, and he was saying he lost like $60,000 in the first couple of weeks of Chaz being formed. But I think the key issue is going to be the security situation. You can't have business without security, and what you're seeing with all these cities where they're actually defunding police. I think recently Seattle has voted to override the mayor's veto on the $3 million police budget, which is going to lead to 100 police officer layoffs. This is only going to lead to an increase in criminality, which is going to impact business.
And do you see as well potentially militia groups or concerned local citizens forming their own groups to be able to provide protection in the event of a security vacuum if police leave those areas?
We've already seen it in we saw it in Michigan.
Well,
from the start.
Yeah, and from the LA riots, we saw dead, but then just recently, in Minnesota and things like that, in every kind of riot that's taken place, and not just kind of the smaller ones on a daily basis, but the ones in the initial reaction when there's significant looting, significant arson, we've seen individuals protect businesses, whether they've been asked by the owners or not, that's unsure, but we've seen that action being taken. The worry is that it's not just local community members or business owners protecting their own business, but then individuals from out of state who have no links to that community, such as what we saw in, Kenosha, with Kyle Rittenhouse coming in from Illinois to that armed, breaking several laws in that process, and then leading to a confrontation where 2 or 3 people were killed in the instance. So I think that's the worrying factor, is that the mobility of individuals going across state lines, taking up arms, protecting businesses on their own recognition, leading to further confrontation because they're not recognized as a member of a community. So for those community members that are protesting, whether legitimate or illegitimately, they'll be seen as outsiders that are just there to agitate the situation, despite those individuals that come that say, we're just here to protect businesses. From a community member perspective, it'll just be seen likely as agitators.
Yeah.
In Michigan, you saw libertarians or standing guard outside of stores, armed in body armor. And when they were interviewed, they were saying, you know, we're here to, one, protect the peaceful protesters, and to also keep an eye on the police and make sure that the police are doing, you know, not overstepping their bounds. But also, and I've seen footage and images from the west coast of the US where Proud Boys have claimed to be actually guarding stores. And there's an image of them stood out a particular brand. I won't name what the brand was, but from a reputational perspective, that would have a negative reputational impact on that brand if it's kind of felt through a social media post that they're actually protecting that brand as a result of it. And I feel like it's just one of these situations where people kind of watch the media and kind of watch this footage. And recently with the shooting in where you had the right wing demonstrator who was shot by the Antifa guy. You know, these are the sorts of incidents that just feed into that most dangerous course of action, because it just escalates the situation each time we see violence and especially deaths.
And I think you make a good point in terms of kind of a reputational factor on businesses, especially nowadays with kind of the cancel culture aspect of it all. I think if businesses are seen to support a view that's not the view of the majority that are protesting outside, there's the risk that on social media calls to boycott a certain brand, to do certain things. And we know that the left is quite active and able to organize, whether it be by social media or in person. So I think you not only get the risk of your brand being affected economically by a boycott, but also by individuals protesting outside your store because you didn't support their viewpoint. So I think reputationally, it's very much on edge, and we've seen it with kind of hate crimes during the last few years when it's increased, especially during COVID-19 against Asians, where there's social media accounts finding the individuals who are committing the hate crime, whether it's verbal abuse or physical abuse, being found out by left-wingers or others, and then finding out their place of employment, and then that place of employment being contacted, being like, this is what your employee is doing, fire him, basically. And there's been hundreds of people that have been fired because they've been caught out on social media verbally abusing Asian Americans or anyone else, and then in return being fired. So I think brands are gaining a level of responsibility on this stage that they can't kind of turn away from.
I think as well, in light of a security vacuum, business premises are also increasingly going to be targeted for potential extortion by groups for either money or for products, and as well as static business sites being affected by localized unrest. There's also logistics, postal services that are apprehensive or do not want to go into a certain district or neighborhood to be able to deliver. I think we had issues with that with Chaz, as well as workers and professionals. So what you're finding is in a lot of these urban areas or cities which have been affected by unrest, such as Seattle and Portland or New York, you've got urban professionals or business owners from the middle classes now who are essentially leaving those areas. So you've got a huge brain drain and also a reduction therefore in your tax base. So I think in the medium to longer term, we'll see some of these urban areas really suffering as a consequence of that, because the employment generators, the local business owners who feel intimidated or they've had their stores looted, they're going to up sticks and leave if they don't feel secure in that environment. And so again, that just exacerbates the situation within these communities.
A good example of that is the recent incident with Palantir. So you've had protests over some of their contracts linked to deportations in the US. So now they're actually, Palantir are moving their headquarters from Palo Alto to Denver. So you're actually having a good riddance celebration protest as they leave, and then an unwelcome protest near their Denver HQ where they're moving to. And I think for some of these people who see themselves as revolutionary, once they're finished with the police and they've actually effectively defunded the police, will they then move on to other companies? So will they, first obvious targets are companies that work with security services, police. So we've seen some of our competitors who were helping police to actually monitor protests in relation to Black Lives Matter as well as Antifa protests, who then saw articles regarding them online and their support. of them. But we've also seen protests against people like Amazon and Jeff Bezos. And it's not just by the left. I mean, I was looking at some recent social media posts by Proud Boys who were making a statement that the enemy is in the boardroom and kind of blaming big business. So, the worry is, as America becomes more polarized, and will the targets of these protest groups shift from the police to large multinational companies who they feel are having an impact on the environment? And it's something that we will certainly be monitoring, but it's something that I do worry about.
And could that escalate from protesting outside or vandalizing a property to actually targeting a business with a bombing or a shooting? We've seen in the 1970s the Weather Underground, who saw that their movement wasn't gaining traction in the mainstream. They essentially went down the path of increasingly violent terrorist actions against their perceived opponents on apparatus of the state. So I think as we see an increasingly polarized domestic front on the United States, we could sort of see these actions developing in the future.
I think if they see that their tactics have worked against an organization like the police, then why wouldn't they just move those tactics over to another target group? So why wouldn't they conduct mass protests for an ongoing period, as well as using tactics like doxing certain people within an organization? So I can see this target profile of some of these groups switching from the security apparatus to companies that they feel are having a significant detrimental impact on the community.
And could we also see lone wolf actors resorting to, say, more lethal measures, such as on the far right, targeting a company or business which is perceived as being woke, or having views which are opposite to hardcore Trump supporter or QAnon follower, and targeting that business with maybe a lethal device or some form of weaponry?
We've seen social media companies being targeted because of their perceived bias towards certain political groups, and I could see that exacerbating going forward. Groups that feel like they have been impacted by that company, then seeing direct action against them by whatever group it is who feel as if they have been impacted by that company. So yeah, I can see it evolving as well.
So looking on the international front, how do we see the United States relations on the world stage panning out if Trump regains power?
I think probably much of the same. I think he'll continue to have focus on China and Iran, because I think domestically that's proven favorable in regards to his supporters. I think, yeah, so I think that's probably where his focus will lie. I don't think, despite the rhetoric that he's given to other countries like Venezuela in South America, I don't think there'll be likely an escalation in terms of an actual operation from the U.S. government to kind of oust Maduro from power. I think he'll continue to focus towards China and Iran during that time.
Do you think that he'll also be emboldened to carry out potentially further trade or negotiations with China to try and get an even greater advantage as he perceived for the United States?
Probably, just because, I think we talked about him being emboldened on the domestic front, just if he is reelected and because of survival from impeachment from a number of scandals. So I think another term would likely embolden him to further his policies towards China, especially with the support he's gotten. Although he'll have to have results, or he could lose support, because despite the trade negotiations, farmers in the U.S. still have hurt because of those negotiations. So if they continue on a prolonged period to where some sectors of his base aren't receiving the support that they expect, then he could potentially lose. So I think he'll focus and he'll continue his hardline policies towards China, but I think he'll have to be tactical as well.
I think either president will have a huge challenge with the economic ramifications of the COVID pandemic. We've seen mass layoffs now. We've seen social unrest as well, and there's very few immediate responses that the U.S. government can do, other than money printing from the Fed or quantitative quantitative easing. So I think either president will have a significant challenge in the immediate future. How do you see a Joe Biden victory on the international front?
Yeah, for Joe Biden, it certainly will be quite a difficult task. Excuse me, pardon me. Of course, with a lot of recent reporting, Joe Biden's there's often been reporting from sort of Republican supporters and Republican campaign ads that show Joe Biden being very pro China, and of course with the outbreak of the coronavirus, there is of course quite a bit of hostility towards the Chinese government for various actions taken and not taken. Also, I think one thing that Joe Biden will have a lot of difficulty with if he is elected president when it comes to the international stage is dealings with Russia. Now, in the wake of the Russia collusion scandal, where there was allegations of trying to impeach President Trump, the Democrats it actually became revealed that there's actually more evidence of the Democrats engaging in the sort of corrupt behavior that they were accusing President Trump of. And one name that came up quite a bit was Joe Biden's son, Hunter, who, based on a lot of anecdotal reporting, has quite a lot of business dealings in Ukraine. So, if Joe Biden were to be elected president, when it comes to his approaches on the world stage, any kind of interactions with Russia, well, if he takes a bellicose attitude towards Russia, any sort of cynical commentator could make the allegation that he's simply being bellicose towards Russia in order to increase business opportunities for his family.
And we saw that the Democrats historically had a more antagonistic approach, I think, to Russia. Looking at the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton, do you see Joe Biden looking at Iran and trying to continue with Trump's policies, or potentially attempting to renegotiate a nuclear deal?
That's going to be one very, very tight rope to walk. Simply because in the wake of the Iran nuclear deal, there was quite a few allegations that came from after the Obama administration of a lot of money being sent to Iran by cash, in which Iran's known for its global sponsorship of terrorism. So there was, of course, links right away towards the possibility of the US, under the Iran nuclear deal, providing money. Were they in fact providing money to terrorist groups that Iran was supporting? Mm-hmm. Also, another factor is actually very recently President Trump has sealed quite a lot of peace deals between Arab nations and Israel that appear to have the potential to normalize relations between those countries. Now, historically, Arabs and Israelis have not gotten along whatsoever. So these recent peace agreements appear to be kind of a game changer. So, with any kind of approaches towards Iran, if Joe Biden were to be elected president, if he took sort of a view towards Iran of how he and President Obama approached it, well, that there's a chance that would undermine a lot of the recent agreements that President Trump has put into place, and could actually have a negative impact on something that could be a potential game changer for relations in the Middle East for years to come.
Trump's tried through this to be the peacemaker in the first term of his presidency, and he reached out to North Korea with Kim Jong-un, but then also more recently with the work that he's done with Israel and some Arab nations. But at the same time, he's exacerbated the issue with the Palestinians by the decision to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. The wonder would be, with a second term, would he again try to begin talks with North Korea with the whole nuclear disarmament aspect of it, and would he try further to push more peace initiatives in the Middle East? From Biden's foreign policy perspective, he's already stated that the Israeli embassy will go to Jerusalem, it will stay in Jerusalem. He stated that he wants to restore alliances, promote human rights, as well as stand up to dictators. From the Chinese perspective, the tariffs that Trump has put in place on China, it seems like that would be a good leverage point for Biden to begin conversations with China. But then also, if you look at Russia and America's position on the Nord Stream gas pipeline, I can't see Joe Biden kind of pulling back from that because it provides Russia with so much leverage with Europe. I think Joe Biden will continue with that push back against Nord Stream. But I also think there'll be an opportunity for Joe Biden as president to try and sort of heal some of the rifts with international bodies that President Trump has kind of clashed with.
Historically, Trump's always had a bit of a contentious relationship with NATO and some European Union member countries. How do you see the Joe Biden government trying to establish relationships?
Well, that's kind of, we talked about kind of which countries might see focus. And I think with every presidency, there's a period of time kind of in their foreign policy where they pivot towards something somewhere. Obama did so with Asia. And I think a Biden election would likely kind of see a pivot towards Europe and try to rehash and kind of rework those alliances in Europe that seem to have taken a slight hit during the Trump administration. And like Michael mentioned, in terms of international bodies, NATO being one of them, the UN, the WHO, I think there's going to be activity on the world stage that will need to be taken by the Trump administration to kind of work on those alliances, especially if he's looking at kind of renegotiating with Iran, if that's a pivot he wants to do, or with other countries. I think rather than going at it alone, which has very much been the America First policy of Trump, I think based on the Obama-Biden administration, of which Biden was part of, and kind of the way they've done things, I think seeking kind of international bodies and international alliances as groups to handle some of these situation and actors is likely kind of what the Biden administration might do.
So in summary, the Biden administration will take a more multilateral approach to diplomacy and also attempt to re-inject US participation into foreign bodies such as the United Nations and NATO, and potentially taking on more of an active role in those, rather than previously we've seen, like you said, Trump taking a more unilateral approach to foreign policy.
And I think that's also could be a point of contention for Biden in regards to antagonistic and protest against him domestically, because the argument is that kind of Democrats are globalist, which is something that the right isn't too much of a fan of. So trying to take part in those organizations once again might take a hit on the domestic front for Biden. So it's something that we'll have to keep an eye out in the future.
And finally, how do you see the relationship with Mexico? The wall has always been a contentious issue. Trump and Mexico have had an interesting relationship over the last 4 years. How do you see a Joe Biden administration taking on that?
Well, I don't think there'll be a change in regards to kind of the wall. I think the rhetoric will kind of change, and because I don't think Democrats are anti-border security or pro immigration per se, pro illegal immigration per se. But I think he'll probably change the rhetoric to where he'll say that what needs to happen is that border security needs to happen. There needs to be more resources at border checkpoints. There needs to be more recruitment to man checkpoints, to man the border. Because right now the border wall, most of the sections that we've seen erected are just replacement of pre-existing border fence. So I think if he doesn't want to alienate kind of and wants to bring people back to the middle, I think he'll have to be strategic in the way he puts the rhetoric towards the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think the relationship with Mexico is one that we'll see what happens just based on what's happening in Mexico in regards to kind of anti-government protests towards Andrés Manuel López Obrador currently taking place. So I think who knows what a Mexican government will look like by the time Biden's elected, and if AMLO in Mexico gets a second term himself. So I think relationships change based on who runs the country. But I think in regards to domestically and how they want to handle the security of the border, it'll be more focused towards technology, manpower, and at those checkpoints where we see a bulk of kind of drugs coming in, and within a certain distance of those checkpoints where we do see illegal immigration take place.
Thanks, Vincent. So in summary today, Based on the scenario of a Trump re-election, we will see likely further left-wing protests, political confrontation between local, domestic and federal government, and a continuation of foreign policy. With a Biden victory, we will likely see an attempt at rapprochement on the international stage, a reduction in urban unrest by left-wing groups, but a potential for isolated unrest by right-wing groups over future policy measures such as gun control. Being a global intelligence platform, we will be monitoring the entire election process closely and providing threat analysis assessment for clients. We hope you enjoyed our panel discussion and topic. All incident information discussed here is held on our intelligence platform. If your business would like to understand how we can assist your security needs, please get in touch on the link below. If you found this discussion useful, please like, share and subscribe.